This third lecture in Intercultural Transitions is going to talk about study abroad. I'm using study abroad here because it's a good concrete example that many of you are likely to face or have already faced in your college careers. This is not necessarily going to deal with how do you pick a program or how do you finance it. Those are both really important questions, but intercultural communication is going to look at things from more of a communication perspective. Our overview here is going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to look at some of the things that you have already talked about or you've already learned from the previous two lectures. So that way we can make sure that these concepts apply to something very concrete. We'll talk a little bit about some communication priorities before you go and some things to do while you are on your study abroad trip. Based on some of the previous lectures, we want to think of study abroad as a short-term voluntary pull migration. That for the most part it's short-term because you're going to be there for maybe 3 months or so. So we'll think about that more in a short-term way rather than a long-term way. You're probably not going to be there for a year or 2 years, but if you're moving for a degree, that might be much more in the long-term category. It's often voluntary in that you choose to go to study abroad. You have to fill out a lot of paperwork and do a lot of things and try to figure out how to pay for it. So you're not really forced into study abroad programs. And it's usually a kind of pull migration. You're not usually doing study abroad because you hate ASU. You're more likely doing it because there's some kind of attraction of the new place. So it tends to be a pull migration rather than a push migration. A thing to keep in mind is that you will experience culture shock in going to the new place, and to some degree, depending on the type of place you go and how integrated you become into the new location, you might experience a reverse culture shock as well. Now, one thing to keep in mind when it comes to the culture shock is that sometimes culture shock is not about the place you go, but your assumptions going in. People who go to study abroad in the developing world, or perhaps in a place that's very culturally different from the United States, might experience less culture shock than somebody who's, say, going to the UK, Ireland, or Scotland, because the person going to the developing country has different expectations. So it's good to keep in mind that your expectations are largely going to affect culture shock. And that's something to keep in mind as you go abroad. Just because you're going to an English-speaking place that's similar to the United States on paper doesn't mean you won't experience it. Some of the things to think about from a communication perspective before you go is to make sure that you're talking with your friends, family, and especially your romantic partners. Be sure that you listen to them as well. Hear out their fears, hear out their concerns. Hear those things and make your decision about how you're going to do your study abroad, and be sure that you're listening to them and taking them into consideration. One of the important things is to learn a few things in the local language or dialect before you go. And don't always assume that English equals English. That American English and, say, British English or the English spoken in Scotland are not necessarily going to be the same thing. But yes, try to learn a few things in the local language or dialect before you go. That will help you out a lot. And lastly, learn to read a paper map. If you have a paper map, you will be able to navigate pretty much any place. The nice part is that paper maps are safe, reliable, they work all the time. So don't always rely on your mobile device. Maybe you've been using Google Maps a lot and you can use Google Maps wherever you're going, but maybe you can't. So it's good to be able to read a paper map and navigate that way. So just be sure that you have a paper map and that you're able to use it. Or if you don't have a paper map, that you'll be able to read things like transit maps and orient yourself without using a GPS thing or without using your phone. And while you are there are 4 big things that you want to consider, or at least try to do. The first thing you should try to do is use the local language as much as you can. You're not going to be immersed in native speakers as frequently as you are, or completely as you are during your study abroad experience, so do that. One thing to really keep in mind is to balance your technology and social media with physical experiences. It's not saying turn off your phone and don't go on your social media accounts, but it's really saying try to experience the local culture and really be present in the moment. Doesn't mean don't document, don't take pictures, don't journal, but it's really trying to say be both in the moment, but balance your technology there. Be sure you're maintaining your health. You will feel tired. Sometimes tiredness is a sign of culture shock, and I'm not saying ignore that or push through that, but be sure that you're balancing your health with and adjusting as healthily in the most healthy way possible. And understand that the world changes. If you'll go to your study abroad and people will have their lives at home, and they're going to be doing different things while you're gone. And you will be different too. So as you come back after your study abroad experience, understand that there's going to be an adjustment period. It's going to take a little bit of time. And maybe things aren't the way you left them and you aren't the way you left, and that's okay. So, in summary, study abroad can be a good short term exposure to other cultures. It's a good way to think about yourself in terms of a larger world. In many cases, this is sort of an acid test of intercultural communication. It's a gauntlet. It's the thing that says, are you really as good at intercultural relating and communicating as you thought you were? And in many cases, it's a good experience because you might not be part of the dominant or normal culture when you study abroad. And some people say, well, I'm never going to do study abroad because it's too hard for me to do in college, and I certainly can acknowledge those things, but it's not going to get any easier. It's not going to be like once you have a job, once you have money, once you have those things in place, all of a sudden you're magically going to go and travel and study abroad. So if you can't do it now, it's good to think about what you need to do in order to have that experience. And maybe if you can't do it in college, how do you set yourself up after college in order to have that experience?